churches are thinking like hubs. This is something that a lot of people have been speaking about the commons, about community hubs, about community space, about being relevant again in the neighborhood, and what does that mean to open up our doors. And obviously with COVID, that definitely has changed, where there's also some virtual hubs, but always a need for gathering spaces and community spaces in the neighborhood. So we're seeing a whole movement like that right now, and a growing network of churches that are thinking like hubs. And so wanted to give an overview of some of the things that we're seeing today. So a great example, of course, is the Spire. And the Spire basically is an arm under Sydenham United Church, where they decided to become a community hub. And so just basically changing their language, starting to talk about we are a community hub, and the Spire as even a separate brand, even though it's not actually separately incorporated, it's still part of this large umbrella of Sydenham United Church. And just saying, like, what does the space look like? So Arts Group moved in. When people have events, they often choose the Spire. And you can see the ripple effects that now they have the Project Community Garden and all these other things that come with starting to think like a hub. So this is a great example of the mindset, not necessarily too much different about the church, but, or the building itself anyway, but really reframing themselves within the community of who they are and who they represent. And having this garden here, seeing the pride flag, seeing the accessibility, all these things start, when you start thinking this way, what comes together of how you're presenting yourself in the neighborhood. So there's lots of different versions of churches as hubs, and really it depends on the neighborhood, it depends on the context, and that's something that we're seeing. So we're seeing Center of the Arts, cafes and catering, different themed hubs, co-working spaces, agri-hoods, and social enterprises, all popping up in church space. So let's get into some of these examples. Centers for the Arts, a lot of communities of faith are thinking like this. So a great example would be Bradford, Center for the Arts, really leaning into the community and making space for artists, and not just one type. You can see visual arts here, and then you can also see musicians. What was neat about this is when they came up with this idea, they're right downtown Bradford, they're on Main Street, and they said, like, is this needed? So the first thing they did is reach out to all the artists and just start a conversation. And 12 art groups showed up and said, yes, this is needed. Then they ran 4 different art events, and Bradford responded and said, yes, this is needed. And so it started with conversations, it started with partnerships, it started with relationships. Even though we're talking about space and buildings often in this, when we think about hubs, it's really grounded in the relationships, and ours is a relational God. So it, this approach and leaning into the neighborhood and loving our neighbor is all part of the underpinnings of thinking like a hub. Art Fest at Crescent Fort Rouge in Winnipeg, really similar. They started an art fest, 5,000 people showed up, and they did that bootstrapping. So basically no budget, just figure it out on the fly. And then they kept on growing, built new relationships, and really are a center for the arts as well, and known within Winnipeg as a place to go for the arts, and many different arts again here. So Center of the Arts is one. Another would be cafes and catering. So food, a lot of people, like, it is our table and we break bread together, and food is important. And so what does that look like as a hub? We see in St. John's, Newfoundland, when the community ministries is called Stella's Circle, and they've launched Hungry Heart Cafe, which does have catering, programming, different events. And this is something that is part of gathering, is food and eating together. So really interesting. Knox United Church in downtown Calgary is looking at the same thing. So they did like a pop-up cafe to test whether or not this was even needed. And then from there, really saw that there was some traction and some energy and wanting to lean into this as well. But we see this as social enterprises with Out of This World Cafe. 5 Oaks Retreat Center also has catering and cafe work. So food can be a rallying point for sure. And there's lots of different themed hubs. So a great example would be a youth center. We know Erin Mills Youth Center is based out of Erin Mills United Church. It was always a shared platform for over a decade of its inception, and then it continued to grow into its own entity in the long run. But that's how it started, and it's great if it stays that way, and it's okay if it changes. I know that the Canmore Young Adult Network is based out of Ralph Connor Memorial United Church in Canmore. So that's another example of how it can start there and be themed and then grow. And that one's not necessarily a hub, it's a network. And so it doesn't always have to be based on place, especially with COVID, there's a lot of virtual hubs type ideas that are expanding now. Edith Rankin in Kingston, it's on the west side of Kingston. They partnered with the West Kingston Seniors Association and created a seniors hub. So tons of programming that happens in the space. This is actually their narthex or their reception area, and they've turned it into like a cafe space. It's pay what you can. So they have the coffee, the tea, cookies, brownies, things like that available. And people are empowered, enabled, welcomed into this space to pay what they can and just have a gathering space. This doesn't look really like the front, the very entrance way of a church. So pretty neat to think differently about it. In St. Andrews in Edmonton, they have actually turned more into a Rwandan center, so newcomer center as a major program under St. Andrews. And so it's by Rwandan people for Rwandan people. So it's really important to ensure that there is joint leadership on this or self-determination. And we're seeing this also in Beaconsfield in Montreal with a Nigerian community, also in Maple Grove with a mainland Chinese community. And so how and when are we actually newcomer centers? Another thing that's been popping up is co-working spaces, and it could be dedicated office or it could just be drop-in hot desks. Obviously with COVID, this continues to change and be reimagined, but this is something that people are investigating. This is actually a sanctuary that was bought by developers, so it's actually still not a church today, but it did get turned into all these office spaces, which is quite unique and not necessarily something that we're recommending, but coming with new lens of what something looks like. Kirk United Church Center, the community of faith that was worshiping there, actually created Kirk United Church Center to ongoing look after community engagement and be co-working and have all these programs. Eventually, it was actually 18 months later, the community of faith decided to disband. And yet Kirk United Church Center continues to deliver ministry in the neighborhood, Dover Court within Edmonton. This is another unique way of looking at it. This is actually the basement of George Street United Church in St. John's, Newfoundland. And so there's a commercial kitchen down there. There's a food ministry and partnership with a community organization. And also then they have these little offices that look like little homes in the basement. So it's very private for psychologists, counseling, things like that. But this is actually in the basement as additional space. So not that interactive co-working, but still a very creative way to do this type of thing. Agri-hoods. Agri-hoods is basically any sort of food and farming. We're seeing a lot of urban farming and learning and programming around gardens. So here's one example is the Christian Resource Center, which is actually now part of Fred Victor in downtown Toronto. They actually manage over 100 community gardens throughout the city. And so best practices around that and supporting that type of work, which then comes back into their food ministry where they serve and feed thousands of people. Robert McClure's, they actually created a farmer's market. So once a week, people come and gather. And it's not just food, there's musicians and local artists, and they've also leaned into, they have a newcomers group who's learning English within the church. Many of the women who are part of that are starting their own businesses, and so they're being encouraged to actually sell during the farmers market as well. In Wellington United Church in Prince Edward County in Ontario, the church has actually launched 8 food businesses out of their commercial kitchen. They've also created a farmer's market. They also have food trucks that show up. It's now resulted in a large tent that does Shakespeare and weddings outside. So it's really interesting once you do one thing, how there's adjacencies that keep on adding to what this hub approach can be. Another starting point, and this is happening definitely in Kitchener-Waterloo, Cambridge, and Guelph, is food trucks. So in their large parking lot, seeing the abundance that they have. It doesn't always have to be in the building. They've actually created food truck nights where people can show up. There might be 7 food trucks in the parking lot. They have musicians, and it's a gathering place outside that people can be in community. Then not only do we create the spaces for other programming, sometimes we actually do our own social enterprises. And basically social enterprise is when we create more social, spiritual, and ecological impact by using business practices. But financial is not the most important part of this work. So when we look at social enterprises, there's lots of different examples of different ones that could happen within your hub that you might actually be managing. We've done some research of which ones are the best fit with some of the abundance and gifts that communities of faith have, United Church specifically, and here they are. The first one is to actually have a bike shop. We've seen in St. Columba House in Montreal that they actually created that. Not only do they provide the parts and help in fixing bikes, but also the training and supporting people so that they can do their own bike maintenance, which really does give a lot of confidence, empowerment, as well as transportation. Then you have the furniture bank. Furniture bank basically allows you to actually donate. The furniture bank actually stores furniture that's donated. Often they charge a fee for pickup of the junk or furniture. And then they are sourcing it and connecting with people who do need furniture. So often that needs a lot of space, which can be a challenge. Community innovation hubs is just becoming a space for these programmings and becoming that community hub. Landscape, lawn care, that is a social enterprise that's popping up in numerous locations. Catering, we already talked about. Garden and shop, so the neighborhoods and food and programming around that. A tool library, that's when you basically have your own tools and people can rent it out, but not everyone has to buy their own chainsaw, let's say, an emo. So that's basically a gathering together space and supportive and providing employment and training. So this is an example of a community innovation hub who's gathering all this information about churches thinking like hubs, bringing people together for peer support, and continuing to learn from all these churches thinking about the commons and thinking in this new way of what's working and what can be improved. And really at this point, we're growing the network of communities of faith thinking in this way to support each other. So I wanted to just give you an overview of some of the things we're seeing at this point when it comes to being a hub, and hoping that this is helpful in your own discernment of what's possible. Thank you.